The paper reports that 2 of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers!
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Joyanna Silberg, who is the president of the Leadership Council on Child Abuse and Interpersonal Violence. Her psychotherapy practice specializes in children and adolescents suffering from dissociative symptoms and disorders, and her forensic practice specializes in child sexual abuse. She has served as an expert witness in 27 states. She is the past president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. How are you doing today, Joy?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I look forward to being able to educate people about some really important stuff.
Well, we look forward to your edification, or our edification. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Allen versus Farrow. There was a podcast and you were on the panel of Allen versus Farrow of that podcast. And could you tell us a little bit about that and what your thoughts were about it?
Well, I was actually lucky enough to participate in the film, and it was a 4-part film in which the directors, Kirby Dick was one of them, who developed a film using some of the old footage that Mia Farrow had given him about the early life of the relationship between Woody Allen and Mia Farrow and the abuse of their child. And this particular case is kind of paradigmatic for cases around the country at this point in time, because what happened was there was some evidence of certainly some boundary violations, and ultimately there was evidence of some child abuse of Woody Allen against the child in the family, Dylan, and possibly against some of the other children. That's not quite as clear. And yet, Mia Farrow was villainized, and the whole situation was looked at as something that she was producing through her own feelings of anger against Woody Allen. And the concept of parental alienation is brought up into this film, where she is accused of alienating her child and making up false accusations. And yet, if you look at the filming and you look at the contemporaneous information that the filmmakers had access to, it becomes more and more clear as the film progresses that this was a real event in the life of Dylan, where she clearly had memories of being harmed physically in her relationship with Woody Allen, about sexual abuse that she experienced at his hands, and the way all of the political forces in the world organized themselves, protecting the abuser and vilifying Mia, is so typical of what happens in the world in cases where people are not as well known. You might want to say, well, of course, because Woody Allen was a famous film director, everybody rallied around him. But it often doesn't even matter whether someone is a famous film director or a pizza delivery guy and his wife is a physician. It truly doesn't matter. In the process of family court, often the person who is describing the abuse and trying to protect the children against the abuse is the one that's vilified, and the terms parental alienation are used to throw a whole smokescreen over the entire process and make it look like all of the abuse allegations were just pumped up for the point of trying to throw negative light on the perpetrator because of a divorce situation, rather than looking at the reality of child abuse. But if you look at the number of marriages in the United States that end up in divorce. It's about half of marriages end up in divorce. And if you look at the frequency of child sexual abuse against girls, it's generally about 1 in 4. Against boys, it's generally about 1 in 6. And you look at the people who are most likely to commit those abuses, it's usually a close family member, a stepfather, a father, an uncle, a grandfather. Then it would be really remarkable if, with all of those statistics of half of marriages ending in divorce and 1/4 to 1/6 of kids end up being abused, that there by someone close, that there wouldn't be a really big overlap. It would be kind of perplexing if every single case of child sexual abuse in the family happened in non-divorcing families. That would really be kind of perplexing. And yet that's what the world wants us to believe. The world wants us to believe that in these divorcing families, the frequency of child sexual abuse is not so high as it really is. And they want us to believe that these are cases in which there's just anger and antagonism of the mother against the father. So in that context, I was on the podcast to describe the larger reality of these accusations and the context in which they're often levied, and looking at the movie of Allen v. Farrow as paradigmatic for what happens in the world at large. Does that answer your question?
It does indeed. Well, what's interesting about Allen v. Farrow is it shows how Woody Allen groomed not only Dylan, but that entire family for his abuse. But he also, with films like Manhattan, he groomed the world for his abuse.
Yes. I think that's such an excellent point, that the world was kind of groomed to tolerate more and more relationships that clearly are inappropriate, unacceptable. And yet, because we've seen them in movies and we've liked the movies and the movies were made by a great film director, we are desensitized. And I agree with you, the world is groomed to be able to tolerate this kind of inappropriate relationship. There's a suspension of disbelief because it's a movie, and there's a suspension of critical judgment or moral judgment. I think you're right.
And what were the takeaways that really stuck out with you as far as Allen v. Farrow, as you see it playing out in other areas?
Well, one of the takeaways is how incredibly difficult, how it's like being under a tidal wave that the protective parent has in order to protect the child from an abusive partner. And now that I've collected many of these cases, I've seen it with women as the perpetrators and men as the protective parent as well. And even those men as the protective parent, when the accusation of parental alienation comes against them, they seem to have the same trouble. Although we are in a very sexist society, we're in an anti-recognition of abuse society as well. So often, even when the tables are turned, you have that same extreme tidal wave of overwhelming disinformation that makes it almost impossible to get an accusation of abuse to be believed. So that would be one of the takeaways. Another one is, although the fame of Woody Allen is so overwhelming, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't matter how famous you are. When it comes to allegations of sexual abuse specifically, it's virtually impossible to get them to be heard with believability, because either you know about it or you don't know about it. If you know about it, there may be denial because you experienced it, you know people who experienced it, you don't want to think about it, you're inured to it. And if you don't know about it, it seems highly improbable and implausible, and it couldn't be. And when you see somebody who's in the public eye as somebody who's very famous, it just seems absolutely impossible to accuse them of something like this. And it's so easy to say, well, because they're in the public eye, people want to destroy them. And what's so easy to do is for the perpetrators to exploit that public opinion and to have everybody rally with them to vilify the other side.